Essling, Park Interpreter at Bay City State Park.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate everyone joining us as we go through what a wetland is and some of the mechanics that make it a healthy working environment to help clean up our water and provide homes for a lot of animals. Today we'll go through a variety of different things that make it work. We'll look at different animals that live in the area. We'll even take a look at a model of how that wetland can fit into what's called a watershed and improve the quality of water in our surrounding areas. Now I'm going to share a little bit about some things back and forth. Some of it's going to be on a PowerPoint slide that I have for you with some videos. Some of it's going to be me in person, so if you kind of adjust that bar that Karen was talking about to see my face, I'll present up a few cool creatures as we're going along and some different models that I have. And then I also have some sound that we'll be looking at or listening to as well. I have some frog calls that we'll be learning about. So you might want to turn your sound up a little bit for some of those creatures. And with that, I want to get started talking about our wetland areas. Now, the wetland that I am most familiar with would be the Tobico Marsh. The Tobico Marsh is a really large, vast wetland, coastal wetland in fact, that spans over 5 miles to the north. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what is a wetland? You keep saying that word. Well, a wetland, pretty much what it says, is when you have water and land coming together to form a very unique habitat to help support various wildlife and creatures that might live in there that can be unique to that space. Now, for our wetland here, we're going to look at a few different functions. In fact, 3 functions of a wetland that make it so important, especially when you're talking about the Tobico Marsh. The Tobico Marsh here at our park at Bay City has been set aside as a natural national landmark because it's so unique. You will not find any of its kind, or at least of this size, in the Great Lakes region. There's a few smaller ones out in the area. Some are better than others, and some have different unique features about it. And for us, that means sometimes plants and animals that are only found in certain parts of Michigan, or in particular in our area. Now, alongside this marsh, you may find a wetland forest area. So like I said, there's lots of different kinds of wetlands. And here you might find some wetland as well, where animals will live both here in the forest and over in that wetland area. They share both those habitats for their needs. Now, what are those 3 functions of a wetland? First of all, like you saw, a wetland is like a sponge. It can soak up a large amount of water that could otherwise be in other places like your backyard or maybe in downtown. But at the same time, it's also a filter. So if you think about a filter, it's kind of like a coffee filter. We put it in our machine. It helps to trap all that coffee ground. And then we get that leaching, that water that comes through. Well, it helps to filter out some of the dirt in our environment as well, along with a variety of other things, including nutrient and sometimes chemicals that are in our area. And lastly, it's also a home for a lot of wildlife. Like I mentioned, when you have a special habitat, you may find some very special creatures that live there, especially if that habitat is threatened or endangered. You may also find those. So here's an example of our marsh here. So there's lots of different kinds of wetlands. This is the Tobico Marsh, the coastal marshland. You might find a variety of different kinds, especially if you go down to Florida. They have Everglades down there. You might hear of something called a bog, where it's got a lot of things that just sit and don't really decay very quickly. Rivers and lakes, streams, all sorts of different kinds of wetlands, even something called a vernal pool, which we'll talk about later, a very temporary puddle of water. And that's the thing, is that a wetland doesn't have to have water all the time. It's there most of the time, but it could disappear, especially when you get into the hot heat of the summer. Now, a wetland is a very important part of a watershed. And when you're thinking about a watershed, it's essentially all the land in a certain area that collects water and flows it to one particular spot, kind of like a funnel. So some of you, if you got that funnel at home, this is kind of the same thing. You might have a large amount of stuff trying to pour into one small point. That's kind of like what this is here. And for our area, Saginaw Bay, covering over 22 counties, is a very large amount of area, which means a lot of water and things that can flow to one central point. And we happen to be right here, right at the mouth of the Saginaw, or at least close to the Saginaw River and Saginaw Bay, right along the shoreline. Now, to help demonstrate how a wetland works in a watershed, I'm going to switch us over to a model that I have that kind of demonstrates what it looks like when water flows through a certain area. So I got over here our wetland model. And you can see a variety of different things that are in our model. We have farmland. Some of you might live near a farm. Some of you might live in a neighborhood where you have a variety of different houses. Maybe you even have a new house that's going in, new neighbor soon. Your parents might work at a factory or some other business nearby. Some of you might even go visit down the shoreline and have like a club down there. And of course, you see there's a lot of different plants in the area as well, from pine trees and cedars to deciduous trees, plants that are trees that lose their leaves. And we also have a mixture of different wetlands. They're represented by these sponges and some grass areas, especially you're talking grass like in your yard. Now, the grass versus the marsh is very different, especially when you're talking cattail grasses. Kind of like some of the ones you see on the side here, has those brown bobbins. These can have very thick roots as opposed to this yard grass. And when you have water coming into this area, you can see a very, very big change of what can happen. Now, water is only one part of it. You might also have some sediment soils, especially if you're at the farm and you're plowing up fresh new dirt for the fields for planting. Dirt might get turned up here when you're putting in a new house, or even some of those hills where you might be mountain biking or running ATVs, things like that. Dirt can be exposed, they say, where the plants have come off. That happens at times. And chemical from car oils and such, fertilizers, sometimes can come off in extra quantities. And you can kind of see with some of this, like a sparkle type look to it, that can come off behind some of our vehicles. Even in the water, you might have a little bit stripping up from your boats. So that's why it's always important to check some of those vehicles as you're going along. Now, once we add the water into it, let's see what can kind of happen. Especially in the spring season, waters can get very, very heavy, especially when you have snow melting at the same time in the spring. Notice the water's all flowing to the same spot down by that boat in the Saginaw Bay. What are you noticing about that grass already? Yep. It's not staying in place very well, is it? This is called erosion. When the roots are too shallow, water can get underneath that soil, causing that grass to lift up and slide away into the river or even along our shorelines. So sometimes it's good to have a mixture. When you look at, if you see both on the side camera with me, you can kind of see how the grass only holds a little bit of water, not very much. But our marshland along the shoreline can hold a great deal more water. You can even do it in your backyard. You can see some water that's collected here, and you can plant different kinds of flowers and create what we call a rain garden. And that too can soak up a lot of water that could otherwise be sitting in our backyards. But at the same time, along with soaking up the water, that's that sponge I was telling you about, it can also be a filter. So let's take a look at this. Right on the edge here of the farmland, look at all that dirt that was starting to collect up on that plants. See, what happens is that these plants, these large tall grasses, slow that water down, and that helps to slow the dirt from flowing into an area. Water can be a very powerful source of energy. And so that dirt gets caught up in the plants, helping to filter that water. Because remember, where do we get water? Well, for our area, we have a pump out in Saginaw Bay just outside, and that's where the water is drawn from. And that water needs some cleaning. Otherwise, it can get fairly dirty if you don't have the proper wetlands in place. Now, how many of you have ever seen a model like this? Go ahead and put that in the chat if you've ever done a model or a project where you built something like this and tested out some of the wetland area. You could do this yourself if you haven't before, using various things like a pan or some Legos and such and some bags to help create a terrain and test out what it would look like in your area, modeling some of that stuff. Now, a watershed has a variety of different wetlands in it, and they all need to work together. So when you have all those working together, sometimes they can help, but if you don't have the right amounts, it can cause some problems. Here's a video from over in Saginaw, not far from where I live, and this is what happened early in the spring when the waters didn't have enough wetlands to go places. When a large volume of water came into that area, it started collecting in places like here in the streets. Streets aren't very spongy-like. They can't absorb a lot of water, hardly any. And the grasses along here, you can see, are just oversaturated, too much water, and they have no place to go. Various plants like willows can help absorb up. A willow is a type of tree, can absorb up some of this extra water. Now, here's an example of when I'm talking about a sponge with these plants. This is a moss that is growing right inside the cattails here, and it can hold quite a bit of water and dirt. Look at my hand. You can see all that dirt that it trapped as the water was flowing through it, so it's causing that filter effect. Now, scientists are trying to mimic something like that. You can see here where they've taken coconut matting and they've rolled it all up into these long tube-shaped structures, and they put it along the shoreline to help stop erosion. And then they can take plants that they've studied to help put along the wetland zone here, or the riparian edge is what we call it. Plants like willows or cottonwoods and such that have long roots help hold the dirt in place, along with grasses like cattails and sedges. Those rolls will eventually decay or rot, and the roots will replace those and form a natural edge. So they more or less are just there to help hold back that edge till it can establish roots. And there's a variety of different plants that a botanist, somebody who studies plants, might look at. Here you can see some emergent plants, plants that have roots in the water that come up out of the water. Floating plants where their leaves are floating on the surface, like our lily pads, which we often have here at the Tobacco Marsh. Some plants don't have the roots that are down in the soil under the water, but rather the roots are right in the water, floating, like you see some of this duckweed here, or even algae that's floating near the surface. Too much of this, though, can be a problem, and that can block out sunlight for submergent plants. These are plants that are down under the water. Now, think about that. Why would you need those? Well, they're a home for a lot of insects, which are food for critters. They also chew up things that are on the bottom, decompose things, we say. But they're also producing oxygen. Yep. Think about the trees that are above surface in the forest here. They take in our carbon dioxide we breathe out, and they soak in, or they give off oxygen for us to breathe in. Same thing happens in the water. These plants that are submerged are going to take in that carbon dioxide from the fish and other creatures in there, and in turn produce oxygen for those animals to survive underwater. So everything in moderation and good balance causes for a healthy environment. And that's why it's important to study and monitor these different kinds of plants in an area. And it's good to have a wide variety of them, not just one or two. But if you see here, you can see cattails with the brown bobbins. You can see these pink flowers here known as swamp milkweed. Both of these providing flowers for pollinators, bugs, birds, all sorts of different things, along with some grasses and sedges that are growing in here. Various types of short grass that can grow in it. And it's a good mixture we call a biodiversity. Okay, biodiversity meaning a good mixture of different things, not just one or two. Because if something were to happen to cattails and that's all you have, how much marsh are you going to have left? Probably not very much. So it's good to have a good mixture of both the plants and the animals, having both. Now, sometimes this can be interrupted by plants like this one. This is a frogbit plant. It would be in the floating plant group, so the roots are just floating in the water. Even though, if you look at it, it looks like mini lily pads. That's why sometimes it gets missed. And this plant is not from here. It is from Europe, and it was introduced by sometimes ponds, aquariums, things like that. And then eventually it takes over a place very quickly, and it replaces a lot of our native species of plants. What I mean by this is that it's known as an invasive species. So it's not from this area, and it causes harm to the area as well. And in this case, it's damaging the environment by taking over the space of other animals, and it also blocks out the sun very effectively for any submerged plants, which causes harm to animals that might live in there. Now, frogbit's not the only one. There are a lot of other ones that can cause problems in our cattail marsh. And so it's important to understand how it works. For instance, here at our marsh, since it's an old marsh, our cattails are like giant floating mats. You can see here as I'm bouncing a big mat up and down. And these can be sometimes several acres in size, large spaces. But if you notice, look real close, you can see tiny little plants that are growing right alongside those cattails. There's enough space for a lot of other plants growing in there. Some of them are helpful. Some of them are not helpful. Like you see here, this is purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife, although pretty, isn't very effective for a lot of animals to survive with. Pollen isn't that great for some animals, and it often takes over a lot of the cattail space. When it does that, it then replaces some of our native plants that some of our native animals and other creatures have learned to rely on. One that's even harsher is the phragmite grass. And you can see here where they cut a trail right through that tall, tall grass. And it's very, very thick grass. And unfortunately, when it's so thick, you don't have a lot of what we call biodiversity. There's not many other things that are living or growing in that dense mat of grass. Now, what other things am I talking about? It could be birds or other mammals that might get. So we use a tool called a marsh master. You can see here how it's starting to break up some of that grass as it dries. But at the same time, it has a tiller in the back that's breaking up the root structure as well, allowing some of our native plants to get a chance to take root and grow. This is an important management process that DNR and wildlife will sometimes use, especially out here in our marsh areas where this grass becomes very thick. Now here's one example, especially in our area, of an animal that relies very closely with the cattail, and it's known as the red-winged blackbird. Their nests are built literally on the cattail grass, like a giant bowl. You might often hear them singing. I always hear it like a turkey, turkey type sound. And they're often the male that you see here coming out and staking a claim in the early spring and then building a few nests for the females for them to check out. But they're not the only animals that live out in the marsh. Again, we were talking about the marsh having a lot of wildlife space. So there's a wide variety of animals that work out there that help with the environment. No better example than our beaver. They do an excellent job working on building wetlands. Here you can see a female that's chewing up what we call an aspen tree. This is a softwood tree, so it's very spongy-like. It helps to soak up a lot of water. But it also has food and habitat space for a lot of animals as well. As you can see, this female beaver, she's using very sharp teeth. You can kind of see on the video by my side over here. These are some of the teeth that continually grow out of that jaw, and they help like pinchers to chop, chop, chop that wood right off. And typically, they chop the trees down toward water or at least very close to water so that they can swim with that branch to their food pile. Here you can see that this one, she's about to chew it off, and then she'll carry it away to her food pile. There we go. Dinner time, kids. Now she's gonna take some of that other scrap and she might build what we call a dam. It's different from their home known as a lodge, which would be a large bowl of sticks. Now, how many of you have ever seen one of these beavers before? You can put that in the chat. If you ever seen a beaver before in the wild, or even seen maybe their sign, like a dam or a lodge, go ahead and add that in the chat if you've seen one before. But again, their home, the lodge, it's like a giant bowl sitting in the water with this moat, this water all around it protecting them. But when they do that, they're not only flooding out an area to help create wetland, but also providing habitat space for other animals. So just like our scientists locally, they're helping to add to our wetland environment. Here's a great example. Our state reptile, the painted turtle, is here sitting on a log that was chopped down by our local beavers, and it's basking. What does that mean? It's taking some of the solar energy from the sun and absorbing it into its body. It's converting that energy to help it to move, digest food, and do a lot of things. Now, the painted turtle is one example of a turtle that lives in our area. We also have in our area, although it's very uncommon to see, is this one. This is a spotted turtle that can be found. This is known as an endangered species. There's very few of these left in the area that are breeding. Characteristic with these yellow spots, large yellow spots, and kind of a yellowish orange throat. And it's very uncommon to see them, but we still hope to have a population growing in our area as we take care of and manage our habitat. Another species that we have, and we actually have one here at the center, this is Foxy Boxy. She is an eastern box turtle that was brought to our center. She had some injuries to her shell, And over time, she has kind of become accustomed to people. It's not good to move animals from one area to another because they may have disease or things like that. So we've cared for our center, and she's, as you can see, kind of lost her fear of humans. Typically, this shell would close up to help protect her body. But she lives in what's called a wet meadow. Those would be those low, shallow areas where the grass sometimes floods over just for a short period of time. That would be on that forest edge area as well. And she loves eating things like worms, poisonous mushrooms for us, but great for her. Even for us, she likes eating our tomatoes. So she can eat a wide variety of different plants or even critters by rotten logs that she might dig up with these strong claws you can see here. And when this is a female, we can tell because she has a flat tummy. Males tend to have a little divot into their tummy to help indicate that. Now, she is a reptile along with a lot of other turtles. That means that they have scales on their body and they have cold blood, so they can't warm up their bodies like we can. They use that sunlight to warm up themselves. But they also will lay eggs. And for some of our turtles, a lot of our turtles in our area are going to bury those eggs very deep into the soil nearby our areas. See, that's why that forest I was telling you about is very important. Those eggs will get buried down deep, maybe about 20 inches, 15, 20 inches into the ground. And they look kind of like this. We kind of describe them as like a leathery type feeling. And these are babies that are just hatching out, and they have this little sharp tooth in their nose that falls off very shortly after hatching that assists with cutting open the shell. Now, mom doesn't take care of these turtles, these little baby hatchlings. They're going to hatch out, and then they're going to climb out of that hole and have to survive on their own. So that means that she'll lay a good 30 sometimes eggs in a clutch, they call it, in hopes that some of these will survive. When they're first born, they have a soft shell, and that has to harden over time. So that's why it's important to have some of these different plants to help create cover for these turtles to survive in the area and hide, camouflage into the area. Amphibians, on the other hand, take a different approach. They're going to lay their eggs in the water from our area, and in fact, this bullfrog tends to be found all over the Tobico Marsh area. They're going to be one of our largest, and they have a very unique call. That call sounds kind of like a deep drumming type sound, but there are a variety of different frogs that live in our area. For instance, here is a spring peeper, one of the first ones we see in the early spring. You can hear. How many of you ever heard that song before? You can go ahead and add that to the chat. Have you heard this peeper before? Or which other ones have you heard? Maybe a wood frog quacking in the early spring. There's a wide variety of different frogs, and this is on Lang's calls. I'm going to show you right at the top here, Lang Elliott, Music of Nature. And you can go through and learn some of these different frog calls and what they look like to try and help identify them. Maybe as a citizen scientist, you can help us to monitor their populations. And I've included a link at the very end to help you on your journey as well. Now, frogs have a very different life cycle compared to some of the turtles or lizards we might see. Some of you might have heard it before, that metamorphosis cycle. And so their eggs start out very differently. Here you can see this jelly-like mass we describe. It's very soft. You can see the baby in the center. And then these hatch out into a tadpole. It looks like a little fish. And here you can see a very small one as it's growing up. Now, when it first grows up, it's going to have this long tail. So that dot grows that tail out with a finnage. And this can be varying depending on the species. They also have a mouth. That mouth is special for scraping or rasping for different kinds of foods. Maybe algae that are growing on the side, maybe some plants that are on the bottom. Even near the surface here, you can see a little one going along. They'll pick at the bottom for anything that's decaying, from leaves to dead animal, plants, and such. But as they grow and get that energy, they're going to change their body structure, grasping along as they go, kind of like a snail might do as well. You can see real close on this snail as it's trying to scrape that algae. Now as they get bigger, those legs start growing out. And they'll also change from their gill structure inside to lungs and start exercising them. And eventually that tail will grow off and they'll eventually hop out of the water. They can often be found in these local wetland areas known as vernal pools, just grown, and they kind of like form right on the side of our wetland marsh. They're only there for a short period of time though, from the snow melt and the early spring rains, and eventually dry up toward the summer, which means these tadpoles have to grow up fairly quickly in order to turn into a young adult before that water dries out. Some of them are a little bit different. Here is a salamander larva, a tiger salamander larva, that has gills on its side like a giant lion mane. Now, its body structure has a tail, so it'll retain that tail as it's growing up. But there are some that stay this way their entire life, known as mud puppies. Those are a threatened species in the state of Michigan and are very uncommon for the Saginaw River area nearby. And they can get 2 feet long and stay in the bottom looking for all sorts of creatures. They're really neat to see. But if it is a true salamander that comes out of the water as terrestrial, we call it, they might turn into this guy. This is a tiger salamander who we sometimes find out in our marsh area on the forest edge. And they live under logs and under the stumps of some of our trees. And they burrow through looking for different kinds of insects and creatures. So you can see there's a wide variety of different kinds of creatures that might live in an area that we often share with them as well. Here you might go kayaking. Some people like to come to our beach and build sand castles, or even take a walk along our shoreline. We have a wide variety of different birds that you might see along our shoreline. Right now we've seen this one here. This is a wood duck that we've seen along our shoreline edge, who are migrating through. One of the biggest reasons we have our Tobico Marsh and we protect it is because hundreds of thousands of birds like this one will migrate through the area. Or maybe say our king rail. This was a photograph by one of our scientists in the area along our shoreline. Or a more common one, the night-crowned heron. Here it's sitting on a large mat so it can look for fish to feed on. So there's all sorts of different creatures that you can explore here at the marsh that all rely on this specific type of wetland. And each wetland is a little different with a few different creatures that live in each one. Now, some of you might have some questions or are curious about that webpage I was showing you earlier. So I did prepare that slide for you. Here you go. This has a link for you with, again, Lang Elliott with Music of Nature. And they're looking at calls of frogs and toads of the Northeast. And this is something that you can practice and learn some of the calls and songs of the frogs and toads to help identify how many in the area or what species. And you can report that using programs like Citizen Scientist. And down below here is a website where you can help join in efforts if you want to participate with wildlife or DNR programs or such. There's a whole list of different ways that you can join into our fun. So again, thank you for coming out and learning a little bit about the wetlands, how they're a sponge, a filter, and a home for wildlife. And I hope this helps guide you in some new thinking or some ideas that you might have of how you could participate in helping with our wetland or in your watershed environment. Thank you very much for joining me today. With that, I'll turn it over to Karen for any other questions that you might have in the Q&A.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was some great information about wetlands. And we did have a couple questions that we can shoot your way. Let's see. So what happens if the water coming into the wetland is polluted?
Good question. So as you saw in that one short video, you saw how the moss actually trapped some of that dirt. Well, at the same time, plants like the cattails as well, when they soak up the water, they're also soaking up some of the chemicals that could be coming in with that water. And then when the area dries out, it only releases the water, and a lot of those chemicals get trapped inside the cattail. Scientists are actually taking advantage of this idea and putting cattails in areas where there is some pollution. And once it soaks up for a while, some of that chemical, they can remove it and take it to a safe place so they can dispose of that chemical. And sometimes they trap it and break it down, especially extra nutrients like fertilizer that might be in an area that can cause a lot of algae to grow. Good question.
All right, and the next question, are there wetlands that have salt water, like in Florida?
Sure are. There are something called this Florida Everglades. So down there, they can have a very different kind of animals they're living down in their wetlands opposed to ours. Ours are known as a freshwater wetland. And so it doesn't have that salt content, which means your animals are going to live a little bit differently. In Florida, you might have something like an alligator living down those marshes. Whereas up here, most of an alligator you're going to get is our snapping turtle, which some of you are familiar with, a very sharp beak that can snap. You can get fairly large with their shell.
All right, and we do have one more question. What would I have to do to get a job like yours?
So it started out for me, I helped volunteer at my local center with a variety of different programs or projects that were going on there. And that helped me to learn more about my local area, especially the environment. And then as I grew up and went to school, I learned how to interact with different groups and how to share some of this knowledge. But to be honest, we keep always learning. That's the cool thing about a scientist. We're always studying and learning more things and learning new things about our environment and the way we share some of the different aspects of that environment with people. So that's one good way to get going in a career like mine or similar with wildlife. Sometimes job shadowing when you get to high school is a good way as well.
All right, another question just showed up. Are snake salamanders poisonous?
Are they poisonous? Well, I want to address one part first. There's the term poisonous. So typically, if like I eat or an animal eats something and I can get sick from it, versus venomous. So we might have, like this one here, this is a Massasauga rattlesnake, our only venomous snake. So it can bite and inject a venom to catch its prey. But it may also use it as a fence. It's not their typical one that they do. They have a tail that they can rattle. They'll try and run away. So they'll do a lot of things not to get bit or not to bite somebody that comes nearby. That's different when you're talking about like a toad. A toad, and I don't have a mouth for that one, but a toad will have little puffy glands on the back of its head that when it gets squeezed, especially by a predator, it leaks out a poison, a yellowish white goop that is toxic for animals that don't like that taste and they'll spit them out. So we do have a few different animals that can have those different features. Good question.
All right. Well, those are all the questions that I see. I'll leave it open for just a few minutes in case anybody else wants to type another one in. But I would like to share on my screen this slide. So I hope that you guys will sign up for some of our other webinars and check out our web pages for more content, including Nature at School and Nature at Home, and our Facebook page, My Nature DNR. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put them into the chat now. Otherwise, you're free to go. I think that's it. All right.